Installing PyQt on Mac OS X. Hello everyone, Ben Finkel here, and in this nugget, we're going to cover exactly how to get PyQt libraries up and running on your Mac OS X operating system so that you can begin to develop quick and easy user interface GUI applications with Python and PyQt. First things first, let's talk a little bit about what I call the PyQt ecosystem. And what I mean by that is the suite of tools that are required to actually develop with PyQt on our system. And in this case, it's a Macintosh operating system. So we're going to need a couple of different components. We're going to need the SIP library, the Qt library, and the PyQt library, as well as something called Xcode. That's the command line developer tools for making and compiling C programs inside of Macintosh OS. You might already have that installed on your system, but if not, I'm going to walk through the process of getting it there because it is important. Now, this may look like a whole lot, right? Like, wow, okay, now we've got these three libraries, and did you just say compile? I did just say compile, and they're in C. It's very confusing. Well, don't worry, I'm going to walk you through it, make sure that you understand exactly how it's done, because it's actually not that complicated, and it's fairly easy to do, and you only got to do it once. Once you're up and running, you're good to go. So the reason for all this added complication is we got to get around the fact that the Qt library, the library of user interface elements that we want to use, is actually written in the C programming language. It's not natively a Python library. PythonQt, PyQt, is an implementation of that library in the Python language. It goes from Qt to Python to PyQt. But the question is, how do we do that? Because, after all, C is not Python. They're not the same thing, even though Python's written in C. You can't natively expose C libraries in a Python programming language. And the answer is SIP, which also comes from Riverbank Software. And SIP is just a translator for C libraries into Python. In this case, we're going to use it to translate Qt into PyQt. And all of this has to happen, all of this has to be compiled on our machine itself, and that's where Xcode comes into play, so that we can compile these libraries and install them into Python without a problem. Let's go ahead and take a look at how to do that now. I'll start off by downloading the modules I need from the internet. And that is going to begin with PyQt4. You can see the link right up here in my address bar, riverbankcomputing.com. There's also PyQt5 available, but Qt5 does not run with Python 2.7, and that's what I'm running this nugget on, Python 2.7. So I want to go ahead and stick with PyQt4. The differences between Qt4 and 5 are large enough that this nugget may cause some trouble for you if you're trying to translate it up to PyQt5. I highly recommend you get a Python 2.7 installation on your machine and work with PyQt4 along with me if you're trying to learn how to use it from this nugget. So I've got PyQt4 ready to download, and I've also got SIP from the same company, Riverbank Computing, ready to download here. And lastly, I've got Qt from the Qt project ready to download. So I'm going to start with the PyQt module that I want. And what I want to download here, you can see there's a whole bunch of different options, is simply the Mac OS source. Now right now the version is 4.11.2. Go ahead and select it, and it's simply going to download, after I get a little advertisement and wait a few seconds, into the downloads folder on my Macintosh OS. That's great, that's exactly what I want. And there it is now. I can see it's in my downloads folder. Moving on, I'm going to grab SIP, and I'm going to do the exact same thing. For this one, I want 4.16.4. Go ahead and select the link, wait for the ads, and the download will start and download into my downloads folder. And then lastly, I'll finish up over here with Qt. Now for Qt, I'm going to go ahead and see that I have 5.3 available, but I want to actually get 4, Qt4, to go along with PyQt4. So I'm going to notice I click that button to show downloads here. And then I'm going to scroll down past the 5 version, down to 4.8. That looks good. And what I want is the Qt libraries 4.8.6 for Mac. Go ahead and select that. Now that one's a little bit larger, 180 megabytes. It's going to take a few minutes to download. So through the magic of nugget editing, I'm going to go ahead and jump forward in time to when that's finished downloading. Okay, and we're back, and you can see that it's just about finished downloading here. There it goes. I'm going to open up my downloads just to make sure that I've got the 3 files that I want. Now I'm going to go ahead and unzip these tar gzip files. This is both the SIP folder, double click it, and there's now a SIP folder there, and the PyQt folder. So you can see now I've got 2 folders that I'm going to use to make and install these 2 libraries right inside of my downloads folder. Now let's get Xcode downloaded and installed on our system. You may already have Xcode installed, and if you do, feel free to skip ahead to the next section. You don't need to see how we do this. But I happen to know that this system I'm working on now does not have Xcode installed. I've got to get it up there. So I'm going to go over to developer.apple.com. You can see that right here. That's where I've browsed to now. And that is going to allow me to download the Xcode program. Now, depending on your version of Macintosh that you're running on, you may need a different version of Xcode. I happen to be on 10.8, which means Xcode 6 is not going to run for me. So I'm going to scroll down here to Additional Tools to find the older version or the previous version of Xcode. I'll sign in with my Apple ID and say never for this website. Oops, didn't get it right. And there we are. So now I can register as an Apple developer, which I will do. I will agree. And they want to know some things about myself, so I'll go ahead and fill this out now. Click register, click continue, and here I am now at the tools, and I can find older versions of Xcode here. And I'm going to go ahead in the search box here, type Xcode 5.1. I believe that will run on my system. And there it is, command line tools for Xcode. That's exactly what I want. Download this 118 megabyte file and once again jump forward in time. And there it is, just finishing up. Now if you're on Yosemite, macOS 10.9 I believe, you're welcome to go ahead and use Xcode 6.1. Maybe by the time you're viewing this nugget there's an even newer version of Xcode out there. It may take some trial and error or a little bit of web research to determine the right version of Xcode for your system, but you will need it and it shouldn't truly matter which version you use. So now I've got my command line tools.dmg. I'm just going to go ahead and double click it so that it will run and install my Xcode tools. There's my package. I'll double click that, and here we can see that it's just going to wizard me through installing these tools on my system. I'll agree, leave it at the default installation. And let it go and jump forward in time again to when this installer is finished. And when it's complete, it'll tell me. I can go ahead and click close and close this up. Right click this and eject it. And I am ready to go. So now we're going to go ahead and get our libraries installed. And we're going to start with the SIP module, the bridge utility between Qt and PyQt. And to do that, I'm simply going to change directory into the SIP folder, start with downloads. And then I'm going to move into SIP-4.16.4. Now your mileage may vary depending on which version of SIP was available when you are viewing this nugget and you downloaded it. But get right in there in the directory, and we are going to start with the command python configure.py-d. We'll pass in a link to the site packages of our Python installation, and then we pass in the --arc switch with x86_64. Now this is all very particular to the Macintosh operating system and the system that I'm running on. If you have a different system, this could be very, very different, so look up the installation directions for your particular system. Come in here, I'm going to go ahead and execute that, and all that's going to do is configure SIP to install on my system appropriately, the right location to install to and the right architecture. And the reason we need the architecture, the x86_64, is because the very next step that I'm going to call is make. I'm actually going to make or compile this SIP library for my system. So I call make, and it's going to run through the commands to make this for my system, and there, very quickly, it's all done. Then I'm going to call sudo make install. That's actually going to make the installer for SIP. Hit enter. It wants to know my password. Key that in, and there, it went ahead and it installed SIP inside of my Python 2.7 site packages. So now the SIP library is available to Python. Next step, let's go ahead and get our Qt library installed. That's right here under .dmg. Give it a double click to launch and mount that .dmg file. There's my Qt make package. I will double click that and once again walk through another wizard that will allow me to install Qt. And I'm going to leave all the defaults right as they are. And once it's finished, it will again tell us that the installation was successful. We can close this, eject our DMG file, and proceed to the last step, which is to make and install the PyQt library. It's going to be very similar to what we just did with SIP. So I'm going to change directory into the unzipped folder, the PyQt folder that I unzipped, which is PyQt-mac-gpl-4.11.2. Again, your mileage may vary on the version number depending on which version you're using. And we're going to use a variation on the Python configure command that we just used for SIP. So you can see once again I'm calling python configure.py, passing in a few different parameters including qmake-4.8. That's a pointer to the qtmake file for version 4, PyQt4, and also use arc x86_64. Again, this is targeting my environment. If you're working in a different environment, you may need to look up the exact command to do this. Go ahead and hit enter, and the first thing it wants to know is if I accept the terms of my license. I will say yes. And it's going to go ahead and start building the Qt module. Or rather, the PyQt module. When it's complete, it's dropped me back to the command line here. And I am going to, similarly to what I did with SIP, I'm going to go ahead and call make in order to make my PyQt module. That's going to take a few minutes to build all these different files. Now it should take a few minutes, and when it's done, I will be dropped back to the command prompt where I once again call a sudo make install, and this will install the library into my Python installation. And there it is. Now it's complete. I'm dropped back to the command line, and I am all set up. I'm all installed with PyQt on my operating system here. Let's take a quick demo just to show off how it works. Alright, I've got a very simple Python application up here using the PyQt library, and you can see the relevant command right at the top. From PyQt4 import Qt GUI. Until we had gone through all those installation steps, that wasn't going to work. That would not be available to my Python applications. Now it is. I can create a new Q application and create a new window with a customized title, my first GUI app. And to see how this all works, I'm just going to pop over here and say Python pyqt1.py. Fires off, and you see what happens is it opens up a fancy little window here. I'll move it around, called my first GUI app. So very simply, a few lines of code. I've got a cool user interface element up on screen, a window that I can start adding to. Alright, that concludes this nugget on installing PyQt on Mac OS X. Your system should now be ready to develop some cool user interface GUI applications with Python and PyQt. I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.